Welcome, everyone, to the 2024 OTF Connects webinar. My name is Kalpana McCann, and I'm your moderator for today's session with Wade Ripta, entitled Beyond Resilience and Burnout, Mental Health Challenges in Education. Before we begin, I'd like to read OTF's land acknowledgement. We acknowledge first and foremost that we are gathered in the province of Ontario on the traditional territories of various Indigenous peoples who have been present on this land known as Turtle Island since time immemorial. We acknowledge that this has been a meeting ground for generations. We are grateful to the stewards and caretakers of this land. As advocates, teachers, and educators, we understand our collective responsibility to honor, protect, and sustain this land. We further recognize and honor within the membership of OTF those who are Indigenous to this land. This practice of recognizing the ancestral and traditional lands in which we work, live, and play is a concrete action that we undertake as a first step towards reconciliation between Canadians and the Indigenous peoples of this land, but it is not our only step. Collectively and individually, we must seek to denounce the injustices and the wrongs that have been committed against the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and to dedicate ourselves to cultivating and maintaining relationships based on mutual respect and trust. Our facilitator for this session is Wade Ripta. Wade is the Vice President of HumanWorks, co-founder of HumanWorks Press, and the author of The Well Teacher. Wade is an occupational therapist who has worked with teachers and educators for over 20 years to help them minimize barriers and remain working in the classroom. He has provided many years of clinical support to HumanWorks consultants and continues to work with teachers throughout British Columbia as part of the BCTF Health and Wellness Program and The Well Teacher. Over to you, Wade.
All right, I need to update that picture. I don't have hair anymore. Give me 1 second here and I'll pull up my stuff. All right, hi everybody. I'm Wade, and some of you may have been in a couple of the other talks, and some of you may not. There'll be a tiny bit of overlap with some of this, but not a lot. Today, we're going to try to go beyond resilience and burnout. After COVID and during COVID, there was a lot of talk about resilience and burnout, and rightly so. I think people are kind of resilience out. There's actually even now a little bit of feeling like resilience is turning into a bit of a word we shouldn't be using as often because it's being a little bit used as a weapon against people who maybe aren't feeling so resilient. So I'm glad we're able to talk about something a little bit different. Just quickly, you heard a little bit about me. I'm from Hamilton, but I actually now live in BC. And I work, my day-to-day work is with the BC Teachers Federation, so with their union, and they have a health and wellness program for teachers. So I spend my days supporting teachers to be well, get back to work, stay at work, and a lot of it is around accommodation and trying to figure out for people, like, what can they do to sort of improve their situation at work and with their wellness. I'm an occupational therapist by trade. My day-to-day, I have a few different hats on top of that. And from that, we wrote The Well Teacher, which is essentially a resource guide for teachers, which is how I've been asked to do some of these talks from time to time. Is just, we were doing our thing here in BC. We wanted to share some information about wellness for teachers. So we did The Well Teacher, and that's how I've become a little bit known with some of that stuff. So as I mentioned already, like, coming out of COVID, we're all pretty familiar with resilience and burnout. We're going to talk about a few other things today, namely more serious mental illness, substance use, and PTSD. Again, same as last week, we could literally spend 4 hours, 5 hours on, sorry if you hear my dog barking in the background. You can spend 4 or 5 hours on even just one of these topics. So we're going to touch the surface. If you have any questions, or if you have any thoughts, please put them into the chat. You can even just like stop me and just blurt out your thoughts. But we will be monitoring the chat, and I'll stop and pay attention. I will, obviously, it's about PTSD, but I'll just be mindful for people that we will be talking a little bit about PTSD and trauma. So if this is triggering for you, just be mindful of that, and you can either mute yourself during that part, or even if you need to step away. And if you need to check in afterwards, I'll be here if you need to do a check-in after that. Also, a lot of this is kind of my experiences and my thoughts. And I know with what we're going to talk about today, people have different thoughts. So I'm hoping that you will share some of those. I also realize that this works oftentimes where I will ask questions and there will be silence, and that's totally fine. It's not awkward for me. I've been doing this for a while now with the whole Zoom thing. But if I'm asking questions, I just ask that you at least think to yourself about your thoughts and maybe why you think what you think. And even if if you're not comfortable kind of sharing that or asking questions of me. Everybody knows how hard teaching is. Okay, like this is well known. Every research study shows it. There's stress, there's violence, there's burnout, there's anxiety. It's pretty well known. So when we wrote The Well Teacher, obviously in trying to make sure that we're providing information that's up to date and relevant, you look at some of the statistics, and there's a lot of statistics out there. We'll talk about a few today, but there's hundreds and thousands of stats that we can use. I just will point out that we're talking today about some more serious challenges. And when we did write The Well Teacher, this one stat out of all the stats, this is the only one that I sort of quote on a regular basis, and it is a little bit dated now, but for me, it was pretty poignant in that of all the jobs. So this study, they looked at 26 different professions, and of all the jobs, they found that teachers had the second worst psychological well-being of all professions. And to me, that actually was not the surprising thing. I already knew that. We already knew how hard it was. For me, I think what surprised me when we did this, even me, because again, I do this day to day, was the group of people that teachers were grouped in with and how the general public, people who are not educators, would have no idea, right? Like how isolating that feels, because people know that people who work in emergency jobs and in prisons and in hospitals, like they know how hard that is. But for teachers to be right there in that group really stood out for me. So, when we think of that, like that's the starting point for all teachers. So when we think about people who may be having some other challenges around substance use or trauma and mental illness, like this is the starting point. That's not the starting point. So those people who are having those challenges still have to deal with what is a very challenging profession, right? So this is the stat that I'll share on mental health. And I showed this last time just quickly, when we think about that and how hard teaching is, right? I don't know if you can, I think you can all see my cursor, but like the best teacher on their best day on this performance stress graph functions at the top of the curve. So this is normal life at the top of the curve for teachers. So it's so easy to slip down the other side when people start having any challenges to their wellness. But when you think about the more serious challenges, it's even extra hard for people to be able to function successfully in a school environment if the starting point is it's a really hard job and the day-to-day puts you right at the top of the stress performance curve. We know that we need some stress in our lives or we don't function very well, but too much is too much. And I'll just look quickly in the chat. Oh, some links. All right. So we'll start with serious mental illness. And what does that mean? I'll start by just giving you a few stats just to give us in sort of the context of mental illness. We know that 1 in 5 Canadians in a sort of given year will experience mental illness. Okay, we know this. There's Bell Let's Talk, and we're all very well versed in the prevalence of mental illness. For serious mental illness, the numbers at any given time are about 3 to 5% of people are experiencing serious mental illness. Okay, so this is really the people that are in many cases having the most challenges related to their mental health. And I'm showing this stat because I think we forget how linked other areas of our wellness are, right? So we know that people who have long-term physical health conditions are more likely to develop mood disorders, and people who have mood disorders are more likely to develop other conditions. So I'm just showing this as to frame the idea that, yeah, people may be struggling with their mental health, but it's not just about mental health. When we talk about wellness, we talk about all the parts of wellness, and they're all interlinked. How you're doing at work can affect your mental health, which can affect how you're doing socially. And so we know that there's many factors that can affect mental health. And also point out that mental illness and substance use disorders are the leading cause of disability in Canada, more than cancer. And it's 1.5 Stats vary from time to time, but about 1.5 more people are challenged by mental illness and substance use disorders than people that will have cancer. So it's just very prevalent. We kind of all know that, but we do forget sometimes about the substance use disorder part of that. So what are we talking about? We're talking about major depression. So many teachers, especially from this time of year through to the end of the year, are going to be challenged by burnout, low-level depression, maybe up to moderate, low-level anxiety, maybe up to moderate. These are pretty standard part of the school year, and also just people struggle who have mental health challenges, right, with these things. We're talking about major depression here. The depression that is more dysfunctional for people, may carry with it some psychotic features, may carry with it just the inability to function. Bipolar disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, panic disorders, so more than anxiety and generalized anxiety, PTSD, schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorders, and borderline personality disorders. Now, when it comes to teachers, for people that have struggled with serious mental illnesses their whole lives, it's really hard to get to the point of being a teacher. System is not set up for it. Great for education. Some does better than others, but it's just a really hard profession to get through all the steps you need to get to. So we don't see a lot of teachers with schizophrenia. We do. There are some, though. There are some. But we do see more teachers who would be diagnosed with what we'd say schizoaffective disorder, where the psychotic features are not as prevalent for people as they might be for some people with schizoaffective disorder, which is a combination thought and mood disorder, right? So we mostly see people in this group with PTSD, schizoaffective disorder, bipolar disorder, where there's fluctuations in how people feel and function with their moods and their thinking, and then major depression. And what characterizes serious mental illness is oftentimes the addition of psychotic symptoms or serious mood-related symptoms. Now, I don't think I need to say this to you, and also you probably share some of my thinking on this, or you wouldn't be here, but psychotic doesn't mean what you see on TV, okay? Like, it doesn't mean serial killer, murder, like you see in movies, okay? Psychotic symptoms are not that, okay? Which we'll get into here in a little bit. I'll sort of describe them a little bit. And the serious mental illnesses are defined by substantial functional impairments or limits to major life activities. So you're talking about people who are really struggling. The symptoms oftentimes for this, and we're seeing more and more teachers with paranoia. Paranoia can be on a spectrum from kind of low to debilitating, from people still being able to access the community to not being able to leave their homes. But essentially, it's what it sounds, how we use it. It's the fear of persecution, threat, and conspiracy. We are seeing more of this. I am interested to know if anybody has a sense of why we would be seeing more teachers who are dealing with paranoia. Does anybody have any thoughts? If you can stick them in the chat, because I have some. I don't know if they're accurate because there's been no studies, but I do have some. Yeah, Laura?
Well, I'm a local ETFO leader, and I'm finding the administration and also social media and parents, kids whipping their cameras out and accusing them of something that's not happened, or trying to get them, on camera doing something, and administrators are not supporting members, and so it just compiles that way.
I agree 100%. That's exactly what I was going to say. I think it has a lot to do with, for a lot of people, their serious mental illness, it's their symptoms build over time, right? So it may start with some anxiety around, why is that student photographing me, or why am I being videoed? Social media and the conspiracies and the doom scrolling that people kind of fell into in COVID, and some people have addictions to their phones and social media. I think there's a direct correlation between the amount of paranoia, actually clinical paranoia people are feeling, teachers are feeling, and that stuff. And then, yeah, not being dealt with in appropriate ways soon enough in the process. So when a teacher first identifies it, and we could have a whole talk on this, but there is a feeling sometimes when people say, and this is trauma, but when people say like, I don't feel safe with what just happened to me. And there's a feeling like, well, you're a teacher and that's part of it. You just suck it up and deal with it, right? And there is that feeling, and it comes from school boards. It also comes from other teachers. So I'm not just going to like board bash here. It also comes from other places, but there is a feeling like you just should suck it up, and then it can kind of get away from people, right? And that's where it's not often that we'll see people who are just paranoid. And usually, if we look back, we can see where it came from. Okay. So Laura, thanks for that. I see that exactly the same way. Psychosis is generally falls under a few categories, which we think is where people are having trouble with their thinking to the point where they're not quite sure whether they can distinguish what's real and what's not. And real is in quotation marks, because real is also not always real. So, usually we think about hallucinations, delusions, and thought disorder, having trouble keeping thinking straight, difficulty with sleep, having racing thoughts, and just having thoughts that maybe are distorted. Severe mood challenges, which we talked about already, difficulty concentrating, memory, problem solving. So you can see if you're a teacher who's experiencing these, like, yes, there are barriers to general mental health challenges, but now we're getting into more serious mental health challenges, right? Anxiety to the point of panic. So you may experience yourself, or people who have actually, like, before they get to work, they sit in their car having panic attacks before the day even starts, or right after the day ends. We've seen teachers who've been found under their desks in the fetal position, having full-on panic attacks. That can happen from time to time for people, but if it's something that's happening pretty regularly, that would be a sign of more serious mental illness, right? And then exhaustion, feelings of negative self-worth are also symptoms. And then thoughts of dying or suicide. More often, teachers will say to me, I'm not having thoughts of suicide, but I just wish I wasn't here. Right? So that would be a sign of something more serious going on, and needs to be taken seriously. Again, if you have any questions or any thoughts, I'm just going to keep moving, but feel free to let me know if you have any questions. And again, I'll check in the chat here as I see things pop up. Oh, no problem. Okay. So what do you see for teachers who are struggling with this? Very similar to the other things we're going to talk about. So none of this is rocket science. Inconsistent attendance and medical leaves. Like, this is a pretty good sign that somebody's struggling, right? If they're not here and they're taking sort of medical leave and they're off and they're on. And we see this pattern of people who are maybe not getting the right treatment. So they're trying to come back to work and then they're going off, and maybe they're changing the medication and different things. So, we see patterns of attendance challenges. People who have had unsuccessful return to work plans where they're trying to come back, but their mental health is such that they're just not able to. Everybody wants to. Like, one of teachers' best strengths is, like, part of my job is return to work. I never have to say to somebody, it's time for you to go back to work, ever. I don't think I've ever had to say that to a teacher. I always have to say, maybe it's time for you to slow down. Maybe it's time to step away. Maybe you should take a day off a week. Like that we're doing all the time. Teachers want to work yesterday, but sometimes the plan just wasn't right for them. And so you'll see these unsuccessful return to work. Just people who are struggling with the challenging behaviors of students and their colleagues. So they just can't manage the same as before when they're having these serious mental health challenges. Difficulty with all the stimulation. If you're having thought disorder, your mind's not sort of thinking super clearly. There's so much stimulation in a classroom. It comes from the lights and the kids and the noise and the movement. The stimulation alone can be really overwhelming. And you'll see that sort of people who are really struggling will do kind of the two things that we advise people not to do, but this is a good sign for us, is teachers will isolate themselves more and they'll work more, but that doesn't mean they're working better, right? So teachers who are really struggling with their mental health will blame themselves, say, I need to be doing better, I need to be doing more, I'm not good enough at this, maybe I shouldn't be a teacher. So they isolate themselves and they try to work more, which is the opposite of what you should do, right? And then sometimes the work site may just become unmanageable for whatever reason, where the person's working or their job. Even if that seems like their challenges might seem unreasonable to an outside person. So if I'm having some paranoia, if I'm having some challenges with my thinking, like there may be somebody in the school, there may be a situation in the school that I'm really struggling with, and maybe that's the only thing. So of course we do want to pursue treatment, but we'll get to sort of rights in a bit. And maybe the best solution is just to be in another location and see if that helps influence the person's symptomatology and decreases the amount of paranoia they have. Because as sort of Laura said, you know, sometimes these things build over time, and you kind of just, after it gets away from people, you might need to look at a different work site. So people just can't be where they are. So this is the point where we run into challenges, because different people have different thoughts on the line in terms of where people can and can't be at work. People have different thoughts on this line with serious mental illness. People have thoughts on this line around substance use disorders, and they have this around trauma. My line is probably way over here in terms of, I think most things can be accommodated. Some people's line is way over here, where they feel like as soon as you're, you know, a little bit odd or anything's a little bit different about you, or you're having any symptoms, you shouldn't be at work at all. Maybe it's somewhere in the middle. But I think the starting point is this, is that teachers have the right to make choices regarding their mental health, their treatment, and their overall wellness, the same as anybody else. And that is in actual, like, their human rights codes, right? That say teachers have the right, you have the right to be mentally ill. That's a weird thing if that's not something you've ever heard before, because people don't choose to be mentally ill, but they might make choices around their treatment and their wellness that are affecting how well they are. So for instance, some people choose not to take antipsychotic medication. Does that mean that they should not have the right to teach? Well, some people would say yes, that they're making a bad choice. But would they say that if somebody had cancer and they chose not to have chemo? They probably would say, no, that's their right. So we get into some kind of ethical, you know, thinking here, but people do have the right to make their own decisions, right? So this includes teachers who do have more serious mental illnesses. And that's scary for some people because they have stigma and they don't really understand them, but it doesn't mean that teachers can't necessarily teach. But there's some buts, okay? There are some buts. The employer and the employee do have an obligation to ensure that there's a safe workspace for other people. The problem is, what does that mean? And I can't answer this question. So my first question for you as a group, and again, if you don't answer, just think about this for yourself, put your thoughts. What is safe and what is not safe when we think about serious mental illness? And I will say that, remember, psychosis is not what you see in the movies. And oftentimes people think that, and I'm not saying this is you, that people with serious mental illness are more likely to be violent or commit crimes. And actually, they're more likely to be the victim of violence and crimes than they are to be the person committing. There's no more, they have no more, their stats don't show there's any more likely to do any of those things than anybody else. But they are more likely to be the victims of crime and violence. So what is safe and what is not safe? Like, what does that even mean when we think about a workspace when it comes to serious mental illness? And I'll just pause, and if you have any thoughts, go ahead. And if not, I'll just move on to some other things to think about. Who gets to decide that, right? Like, these are questions like, who decides like what is safe and what is not safe? And again, somebody who is clearly hallucinating and in their classroom and clearly unwell, that's clear, okay? Somebody who is showing no signs whatsoever of having any psychotic thinking and they're able to function and do their job perfectly, that's clear too. But there's some gray area, but who gets to decide what that looks like, right? What is actual, like, what is actual lack of safety and what is stigma, right? And are people who are making these decisions acting in the interest of the teacher, or are they just defaulting to it's not good for kids because they don't want to deal with the teacher who's unwell? This is the things that we see all the time with serious mental illness, is people's default oftentimes is you can't be mentally ill and be at school, and you absolutely can be. There is a line, but that line is actually more dictated by what's good for the teacher, not necessarily what's good for everybody else. Because again, teachers are very unlikely to do anything in the classroom that is going to be harmful for other students. And the fact that a teacher may be presenting as slightly, again, I'll say odd for the sake of describing it, that just perpetuates stigma. And then you're saying to kids, it's not okay to be a little different. So we have to be a little careful with these things. And these are the challenges we run into when we talk about serious mental illness, is people can make decisions. They have the right to be unwell. They have the right to be unwell and be at work. And who gets to make the decisions around whether they are or they aren't? And the easy answer is to default to kids and doctors, but oftentimes the doctors will even default to the teacher. How do we support people? Pretty straightforward. Again, this is going to be reiterating some other things. Just matching people to the right jobs and to the right schools can decrease stress and help alleviate symptoms. So if somebody's in a job that's completely overwhelming for them, it is a fair accommodation to say, can we look for another option? Okay. Part-time teaching sometimes is all people can manage who have serious mental illnesses, but that's better than not working at all. As an occupational therapist, I see the value of work. I don't think it needs to be all or nothing. Just make sure people have access to the right resources, obviously directing people back to their physician. But we can do things to help people structure their days and take brain breaks and allow for some mindfulness. So there's things that we can do when people are struggling to try to make sure, like the question I say is, are you planning for you? Like taking time in your day to plan for what you need to be able to maybe get through the day with less stress and possibly therefore less symptoms. Okay. And again, this is all very individual, so it depends on the person and how they're presenting. Find ways to limit stimulation. And then obviously there are times where medical leave is required. People need to step away and then hopefully regroup in a graduated way. Okay. So that's a little bit about more serious mental illness, but I think the main point there is it is possible to have a serious mental illness and actually teach. You need some support. And there needs to be discussions around sort of who's making the rules, right? PTSD falls under the category of serious mental illness. We all have a pretty good idea what it means. Both the pros and cons of what's happening right now, and especially since COVID, is that there's been a bit of a change of definition in some ways, which is good, and also bad in terms of PTSD versus trauma. There is a slight difference. PTSD is the trauma triggered by experiencing a very serious event where people believe their life or the lives of others are at risk. There's other definitions, but there's also important to remember that everybody's experiences are unique, and the way that people react to different experiences can be unique. So it's hard. How do we gauge what is like somebody perceives as being like dangerous or as being terrifying? That could be totally different for two different people. So we're getting into a bit of a gray area in terms of what's trauma and what's PTSD, and maybe there shouldn't be a difference. A lot of medical people think there should be a difference, but just some stuff to think about. Usually PTSD, we talk about the symptoms being very persistent and really interfering with function. So people who experience some trauma, like not everybody, many people have had some trauma, and anybody could have a trauma response. People with PTSD have severe responses in triggering situations, or even times when there is no triggering situation and they're just at an elevated place in terms of their day-to-day life because of their trauma, and their fight or flight is kind of constantly on and not having control of their environments, right? So we see a lot of challenges with PTSD, I would say at just a higher, more severe level than you would see on the day-to-day for trauma. But it's pretty gray, right? Because when we talk about trauma, there is no hierarchy of trauma. So what's traumatic for you and what's traumatic for me can be two totally different things. How you respond to something and how I respond to something can be two totally different things. The system likes to medicalize, and the education system does as well. So the system likes to say, if you don't have PTSD, then that's not medical. If it's just like it's trauma, what is that? Trauma is not really a diagnosis, but PTSD is. So how do we accommodate that? It's changing a little bit, and sometimes we get around it by calling trauma other things. But at the end of the day, there's no hierarchy of trauma, so it's hard to categorize. But PTSD, again, when we think about it, it's generally people who are struggling to a little bit of a higher level overall. But even I recognize it's not entirely. And one of the differences too with PTSD is it can't always be treated, especially not in a timely way. So there's lots of different treatment methods for trauma, and people who've experienced trauma oftentimes can work through it with experienced trauma counselors and through groups and with medication. PTSD, though it can respond to those things, it doesn't always, and sometimes it just requires essentially not engaging in activities that trigger that situation, which is not ideal, but we don't have ways to cure it for everybody. Now, there's some new things. Well, we'll get to that in a second. So how does PTSD affect teachers? Same as with trauma, but just a little bit sometimes to a higher level. So you'll see people who exhibit really like broad fight or flight responses. They might seem anxious and withdrawn. Where I think you'll see it the most in teachers is where you may perceive, like it looks like somebody's over responding to situations that maybe don't require them to be emoting or responding on that high of a level. If you think about the day-to-day things that happen to us, they're usually generally pretty neutral. But if I'm starting my day and I'm on this sort of trauma response, fight or flight, stress scale, if I start my day every day at a 6 out of 10, then if something that's a 3 out of 10, I might feel that as a 7 because I'm already at a 6. Where for other people, if they're starting their day at a 2 and it's a 3, they feel it at a 3. So the person's not really over responding for them, but it seems it to the situation because it's maybe not in line with the situation, right? So that's what we see oftentimes is teachers will be like, wow, that person's like dramatic, or that person's really needy, or they really over respond. And when I see that, I think beyond that to why is that happening? What's happening for that person, right? They have difficulty seeing some gray areas, problem solving, difficulty with people. So with that over emoting can come direct challenges like more conflict sometimes, or just totally isolating and not having any conflict, where people just completely shut down. And same with serious mental illnesses. People may need to leave that environment because they just cannot exist in that environment for whatever reason. They may need to look for another place to work. Okay, so that's one of the options. Super individual. But one of the things that will, and somebody has their I'll just say somebody has their microphone turned off. We can kind of hear you. If you could turn it off, that would be great. So one of the things that we do for PTSD and for trauma in general is we try to develop safety plans that identify who's going to do what in what situations, which I'll talk about a little more in a second. We try to set limits within the school in terms of like actual accommodation. So there may be places in the school where the teacher doesn't need to go, or where other people are not allowed to go. So for instance, parents. We may have to limit teachers' interactions with students or with other colleagues as actually part of an accommodation. That's a little bit complex and too much to maybe get into here in terms of how that all plays out, but it starts with medicalizing the situation and then looking at it, what does this teacher need to be able to do their job? That then translates into accommodation, and the employer has a duty to accommodate that. So we are able, if somebody says like you can't set limits on who a teacher interacts with, even the makeup of their class within reason, there can be some accommodations that come into play there, right? So we're changing roles we've talked about. Not being asked to perform sort of outside of the role. So we have, I don't know if you've seen this in Ontario, but in BC, we have had a lot of teachers because of teacher shortages being asked to do other jobs that are not their jobs. But for teachers who are struggling with PTSD, that could be too big of a shift and their stress levels just go through the roof, right? So it's just like letting teachers stay in their lane, identifying specific types of communication from certain people. So from admin, for instance, has to come in writing unless it's an emergency kind of thing. So or they have to be given notice ahead of time if admin's going to come and talk to them about a situation. So, we can put some accommodation on the communication and their participation in kind of the other stuff. I'll just quickly talk about safety planning. A safety plan may be something that's new to you, and it's something that's used often for students, and it's used a lot of times for people who have like epilepsy or chronic heart conditions where there's a risk that they could get themselves into physical distress during the day. But we can do the same thing with trauma if everybody's willing to participate in the process. Now, obviously, it involves the teacher disclosing a little bit about themselves, which they may not want to do, but you can't be accommodated if you don't disclose a little bit. So it's part of the deal. Where the teacher's outlining sort of the challenges they're facing, what their triggers are, and the trauma response. They don't have to say why, like how it started in their life or where it came from. But they outline that and then sort of put a plan of support together that says, if this teacher is triggered and they have this response, who's going to do what? So the teacher will step away and take some time, and the admin will take over for them, or another teacher. Like we have a plan of action where the goal is for the teacher to be able to step away, kind of re-regulate and come back. But if they can't, what do? So it's a plan that supports the actual trauma response as a medical condition. So instead of it being just suck it up or you can't be here if you can't deal with this, it's identifying, no, this is something that we can plan around. Okay? And it's newish, I'd say, over the last 5 years, and definitely getting more popular. Okay. It starts from thinking about trauma awareness. I'm not going to go too much into this, but when we think about what a trauma-aware workplace looks like, it has just general trauma awareness and builds safety and trustworthiness, choice, collaboration, and connections, and just basically a safe workplace. So if the employer is not willing to build a safety plan, but yet they call themselves trauma-informed or trauma-aware, I would maybe call out, how can you be that if you're not willing to actually set up a plan that supports these things that we see here that make up trauma awareness? The treatment for PTSD is super challenging. Sometimes part of the treatment is just time and the person's own resilience and ability to kind of work out what they need. We do know that there's other things that can help. Medication can help. There's all different types of therapies that can help, depending on the person. There's just general trauma counseling and group work that can be helpful for people who are really well-trained trauma therapists. So they don't actually take like one specific approach. They work within what the person needs, and the counselor changes their approach more to a generalist approach. There is residential trauma treatment, similar as you would get for substance use disorders. And also there's programs, because often for this, the trauma can be cultural or experience-based. So we see this with Indigenous people, LGBTQ, different groups from different race communities. Like these things can be very, very specific. So just going for like general, I'm just telling you stuff you know now. This we all know this, that where you can, determining sort of the trauma, the base, like where that's coming from, but linking people to supports that are actually going to support them. That it doesn't exist in every community, but with these days, with the access to things online, it's a lot easier. Yeah. Okay. All right, we're cruising here. Time's flying though. The last thing I want to talk about is substance use. Now, substance use is the most controversial of all the things that I deal with in my job in terms of the rights of teachers, whether they should be at school, when they should be at school, when they should not be at school, and just the idea that if you have a substance use disorder, and a teacher, you're just generally a bad person. Like you should be better. And that is definitely the feeling I've said to a lot of people, and I could have started this with you, but I know the answer. If I had said, is it okay for teachers to have a substance use disorder? And if we put that on a poll, you all would have said yes. The answer is actually no. It is not okay for teachers to have a substance use disorder. Nobody thinks that's okay, except for people who understand it a little bit more and what it all means. But in general, like the general public holds teachers to a standard that is ridiculous. It's probably okay for them to struggle with substance use, but not for their child's teacher, because that would be awful and that teacher should be fired. So yes, we do know, cognitively that it should be okay for teachers to be challenged with substance use. But we also know that from a society perspective for teachers, the answer is no, it's not okay. It needs to change, but that's the reality of the situation. And, there are many teachers that would have no problem telling a parent that they were just finished chemotherapy. I don't know maybe any teacher that's ever been comfortable saying to a parent, I just came out of residential treatment. Like it's just not a thing, right? It's not okay. We know that, I'm just going to throw you two stats here. These aren't big ones, but these are things that come up a lot. Mental illness and substance use disorder overwhelm the system and get only a fraction of the healthcare dollars. And if you yourself have a substance use disorder, or you have a family member who does, you've seen this, it is literally punches you in the face with how limited your options are. You have to pay for service. Now, OTIP has some stuff, but generally in Canada, you often have to pay for service, where in other illnesses and disabilities, you don't have to pay very much. So there's definitely a discrepancy between how it's looked at. It's just discriminatory, in my opinion. That's how it is. The other thing I'll point out about substance use in terms of stats, there's millions of stats. Lots of people struggle with substance use, huge numbers. But a lot of people say to me, you cannot be addicted to cannabis. You absolutely can be addicted to cannabis. 1 in 10 people will develop an addiction to cannabis. 1 in 2 will develop an addiction to cannabis who use it daily or near daily. And what addiction means in this case is dealing with negative consequences, including dependence, that they are foregoing to continue using their cannabis use. So it may not be exactly the same as heroin addiction, but you can have addictions to cannabis. And you might not agree with that. Some people don't. Ontario Rights Code protects people who have substance use disorders the same as any other disability. It is a disability. It cannot be argued. Lots of people want to argue it, but according to, if you believe in human rights, it cannot be argued. A little bit of my thinking coming out here, fair, but it is covered under human rights that it is the same as any other disability. Okay. Remember, teachers have the right to be unwell, and teachers who have substance use disorders have the same rights to accommodation as any other illness. Now, it's not as cut and dry as I have a back injury, I need a chair, but they do have the same rights to accommodation as any other illness. One of the troubles with substance use disorder is that the use of substances can be seen on a bit of a scale, right? Like, first of all, it's legal for the most part. Like, for the most part, substance use is legal. Obviously, like some of the harder drugs, we think of as are legal-ish, sometimes not, but generally it's on a scale where, and to the point where even at times substance use can be beneficial. Even if we take out medications from that, there are times where it can be beneficial. So it's hard to define something sometimes as a substance use disorder when there's a scale that kind of people can sit on. However, we do know that once it gets into sort of more problematic use where it's affecting people's health and their social relationships, how they do their job, it's getting to be more of a problem. Okay. Most of the time, what we see in terms of substance use addiction in teachers is the substance use part of addiction. Like, there's some people struggle with gambling and more social media and internet use, especially people who are, for people who have psychotic disorders and paranoia, they may also be addicted to their phones, right? So they may be at the point where they actually have social media addiction. So we'll see those two. And concurrent disorders, mental health and substance use, they go hand in hand, right? Mostly we're talking about alcohol, cannabis, cocaine, and amphetamines for teachers. When we break that down even more, it's probably even more alcohol, cannabis, and cocaine is mostly what you will see with teachers in terms of substance use. But more what you see with teachers is the shame, guilt, feelings of inadequacy, and the fear that comes along with that. So before people you even recognize, you will see people responding sometimes to these things. And it is actual fear. It is fear of being found out as a teacher. The fear of being found out is what prevents people from actually asking for help most of the time. Teachers are smart. They know when they need assistance. Not everybody with addiction is ready to ask for help or to take help, but teachers know when they're doing sort of things at school they shouldn't do, or they're getting into problems with their substance use. But the fear of asking for help drives a lot of it. You'll see people missing days, but not taking medical leave. And sometimes they will, but with more serious mental illnesses, you will see people who are like on 2 or 3 months of medical leave, trying to come back, 4 months of medical leave, trying to come back. But with substance use disorders, we oftentimes see people not do that because they're terrified that they'll be found out. Because when you do go on medical leave, you need to fill in paperwork, and they're worried that somebody will find out that their primary diagnosis is addiction. So they'll take days off, but not necessarily always take medical leave. You'll see people, now we've all seen this, people who are totally disorganized and you're like, wow, something's going on with that person. They don't seem well. But oftentimes people will over respond to cover for their substance use disorder and actually be like the person who you see as being a perfectionist, or like the classroom's totally dialed. Now, you don't go out and be the substance use police and think like, wow, that classroom's really in order. Maybe they have a substance use disorder. That's not what I mean. But people will respond to cover up. They will do anything to cover up their substance use. Same things as before. Yeah. And one of the things you'll notice is sometimes there's a physical symptom. So some slurring, people look really tired. The slurring is not because they're actually maybe under the effects of drugs or alcohol at the time. It's the fatigue, but also the use over time can slur people's speech. So I think the most important thing to think about here is what stigma does when it comes to substance use disorders. Stigma prevents teachers from asking for help. We know this. I'm telling you stuff you already know. But, when we talk about of all the challenges, like mental health is out there in terms of the stigma and the systemic challenges. But I would say that specifically to that, even more than some of the other ones at times, depends on the district, the stigma of and the marginalization of drug use, specifically for teachers. Alcohol is sometimes looked on as being a little bit more favorable, but a teacher who uses drugs, the stigma attached to that will chase people out of the profession, or else they just don't ask for help and get to really, really dangerous places with their own wellness. So it is hard for teachers to ask for help because of the stigma that's attached to this. The dilemma for teachers, obviously, is kind of what we just talked about, is I might need help, but other people don't see this as an illness, and I don't know how they're going to respond to this. Like if I have a back injury, we know, we see other people, we've seen people take leaves for physical reasons. I don't know how they're going to respond, but I also know that people are going to think I'm a terrible teacher. Am I going to get fired? So it's a huge dilemma for people. And also the question, if I do go for treatment, who pays for this? It's a good question. And the answer is it depends. And we're not going to get too much into that. If you are a person that feels like I want to find this information out, the best place to go is to your union. You can be anonymous and just find out like what are the options available to people with your specific union. You don't have to even go to your local, but finding out your options through your union. I do not recommend you go to the employer first. I recommend you go through the union and find out what's available through extended health coverage, what's available through OTIP, what's available through maybe your own private coverage, and what's not covered at all. Okay. The challenge of treatment is obviously substance use treatment is very hard. And in part of the treatment involves relapse. But relapse is looked upon as a failure when it's actually part of the treatment. It's part of the recovery. Part of the recovery is relapse. And again, different than other, and I'm not picking on other illnesses, but if somebody had a back injury and then they rehabbed it and they were good, and then they relapsed and had another back injury, nobody sees that as being a failure and negative. But if you have an alcohol use disorder and you relapse, then you failed. I hope we don't see things that way and see that as long as people are willing to address that challenge and try to move forward with it, then it's not a failure. When we're looking at treatment, we're looking at readiness. So treatment does not work for people if they're not ready and they feel like they have to do it. So unless somebody wants to do it, it does not work. So really questions of readiness and why are people accessing treatment? OTIP does provide Alavida to all OTIP members. I don't know if you're all OTIP members or not, but OTIP does provide to all their members. Alavida is not residential treatment. It's an online program that you can access through your phone, through the internet. It is, and more online programs are growing out here, even like Edgewood, which is pretty well recognized across the country, has an online program. And the idea is to provide care. You set goals on a daily basis, and there are professionals that work with you and help you with your planning and with your support. And it uses a harm reduction model. I'll talk about harm reduction in a second. But I will point out with harm reduction, more of the severe persistent substance use disorders, in my experience, may not be a viable option. Harm reduction essentially means kind of what it sounds like you don't have to stop drinking, you don't have to stop using the substance that you're using, but you do have to address sort of why you're using it and the harm that's coming from that. So I actually really like the basis of harm reduction because it says, recognizes that substance use is like people use drugs, get over it, is essentially kind of the take. Like this is a part of life. So instead of marginalize people and stigmatizing it, let's just see it as a sort of public health issue that we need to address. So taking away the negativity of it, looking at it as sort of giving people choice in what they do. So harm reduction is about having people involved in their choices of what's treatment for them. and focuses more on the harm and sort of the substance use is secondary to the potential harms that it may cause. So they're focusing on this is why you maybe shouldn't do it, because you can change your life in other ways. So I like it. It's just not super practical for everybody. For teachers who have really struggled over a long period of time, they're definitely more likely those people are more likely to require residential treatment. And that can look like lots of different things, but where they actually go for 1, 2, 3 months to a facility. And there's a lot that comes with that, but that is where a lot of people do need to go, especially if they've been struggling for a long time and other methods that they've used for treatment have not been successful. There are day programs though, and like I said, there's online treatment programs. 12-step like AA and Al-Anon, they're great. They're not treatment per se. They are supports. So people will go to treatment as part of the treatment plan. They will access Al-Anon or Smart Recovery or some type of group work, right? So it's not treatment per se, but it is a part of the support program that's offered. There's medications now. We've all heard of methadone. There's some for alcohol use and naltrexone and Camprol. And there's even, you might not know this, but there's a negative reinforcement drug called Antabuse, which people can take. For all medications, the efficacy and the success of them are questionable, depending on the study. Antabuse makes you feel sick when you drink. So ethically, I'm not sure how I feel about it, but I've seen it work for some people. So but for people who want to drink, when their addiction is such that they feel like they need to do that and they want to, they're like, I'm doing this, they'll do it. Okay. And then there's medical monitoring, which does help. It's not treatment per se, but it does help people, which is where people are either doing breathalyzers many times a day that gets registered, or they're doing urine or blood tests. So sort of how do we help teachers with these challenges is really just, I think the biggest thing we can do is just try to work in environments and foster environments where we're removing judgment and supporting people, seeing it as a medical condition. Addiction is not a choice. So people are not choosing to drink. People are not choosing, okay? Like people make choices and they say, I'm going to go and do this, but addiction is not a choice, okay? So it gets a little gray, but nobody chooses to have an addiction. Their addiction is driven by other things. Substance use is driven by other things. So we have to be a little careful that we don't include with the idea that people are in control of their actions. They are, but to say like, well, you're choosing to have a heroin addiction, that's dangerous and not true. Making sure people know the resources, that we are helping people gather information before they identify to their employer that they're having substance use disorder challenges. So if somebody needs to take some time, if they need to ask for financial assistance, if they're going to identify their needs, that they're doing it sort of gathering all the information before we're identifying anything to the employer. Employers aren't all bad, but you want to know what you're working with and use your union for support. Follow the union. Again, assisting teachers to step away from work where they need to. Even with substance use disorder, the same as with other disorders, teachers will not want to leave work no matter what. Okay. And we may be able to assist with some functional challenges they're dealing with. Say people are struggling with alcohol use, but they're not in treatment. How are they managing their days? There's nothing that says they can't be struggling with alcohol use and still be teaching. Okay. It can be, as long as they are not creating unsafe environments for other people. So that's kind of it. I'm going to walk you through a few things to think about. And I know we're sort of getting close to the end of our time, but I'm just going to leave you with 3 quick things to think about in terms of just general questions. And these are specific. These are specific questions on that I think kind of outlines some of the challenges you may face within these 3 areas. So the first thing, just again, to think about is as an example, a teacher in a small community who was assaulted several years ago, did not report it to the police, didn't tell anybody, but they've developed PTSD. Okay, the person who committed the assault is now a parent of a student in the school. So obviously this is a triggering situation. How could this be addressed or accommodated at the school level? So I don't know if anybody has any thoughts, but just even to think like this is pretty complex, but there are things that can be done to address accommodation at the school level. Okay, so I don't know if anybody has any thoughts. If you don't, it's fine, but just something to think about. because it can be. Yeah, one is just by setting limits in terms of, and you work with the teacher in this case in terms of what will work for them and not, but setting limits in terms of their likelihood of running into this other person. Is that student in their class? Can they be in an opposite end of the school where they're less likely to run into this person? And they could change schools, but maybe that's not even an option. It's a small community. There are definitely things that can be done to address this from an accommodation standpoint. The other question I'll leave you with just to think about is, a teacher has been found drinking alcohol at school. Should this teacher be fired? So your thoughts on that, whether you think teachers should be fired or not. And if yes, why you think that? And if no, why you think that? I'm not going to tell you what's right or wrong. I'm just going to have you think a little bit about, so when we think about all the things we've talked about today, somebody's been drinking at school. That's all the information I'm giving you. Nothing else, just they've been found drinking. Should this teacher be fired? And the last thing we leave it with is, a teacher is known to have some paranoid thinking about a colleague, and that they think the colleague is constantly talking about them behind their back. Should the colleague be informed? So these are the kind of dilemmas that we run into when it comes to these challenging situations. It's not always so cut and dry as you might get with some other things. These are the kind of questions we need to ask, but we start with a place of, what does the person need? Is this discriminatory? Is it in their interest to address these issues? And we kind of go from there. So that's kind of it for the day. I don't know, does anybody have any questions or thoughts? It goes very quickly, eh?
It does. We have a couple of statements in the chat if you want to take a read through them. We've got, Leanna had written that, you can facilitate a change in schools, and you pointed out that if the school community is too small, that may not be feasible.
But it definitely is. It definitely is an option. And the challenge with these things, though, is the weight of changing schools can be really hard on teachers. So they have to weigh, what is the more valuable thing for me, right? Changing schools can be super overwhelming and stressful. But so I try to get people to think, Leanne, I'm not sure about you, but I try to think, let's think long-term and not short-term. Short-term, it's super overwhelming and stressful. Long-term, this is what you need. Yeah. And sorry, I can see, I'll just jump in there. Sorry. Having the principal be the homeschool communicator, absolutely. That in that case would be the case, but a safety plan, 100%. You can have a safety plan here that, one, the accommodations can outline for all these things, how can we keep this teacher as safe as possible? However, we say this about schools a lot. You cannot control an uncontrollable environment. You can try to put some things in place to set limits, but a school is an uncontrollable environment. So there's no guarantee, if that teacher stays in that school, that they won't run into the parent. There's just no guarantee, because you cannot say to the parent, you're not allowed in the school, we can't tell you why. That nothing ever came of that. So a safety plan would say, if this person is triggered, who's going to do what? What's the teacher supposed to do? But it also gives that teacher permission to experience that trauma, right? Like that trauma response without being fearful and being more stressful than it needs to be. Be like, I'm triggered right now. I need to go take some time. And they're allowed to do that. It creates that safety for them to do that. Yeah. Somebody's saying that they think the teacher should be confidentially investigated and supported, but I think in my board, the teacher can be fired. So that, you know what, you've kind of summed up exactly my thoughts in putting that question there. I think people who support teachers realize that, no, that person should not be fired. There is this feeling that, oh my God, the teacher was drinking alcohol and there's kids around. And I just think, but their dad might have had alcohol last night watching the football, or their mom had I just it's this weird thing that we create, that alcohol in school. Now, I'm not saying teachers should drink at school. It is not good. That is not good. For me, it's more of a sign of how unwell that person is. You are seriously unwell. And the teacher themselves knows that. They know, I should not be doing this. I am seriously at risk. Okay. That person is so unwell that they are drinking at school. And in that case, it comes down to sometimes is the use coping, or is it addiction? And sometimes we try to parse that out a little bit, right? Because it can be both, but we try to figure it out. But yeah, I think in this case, if they were fired outright, the human rights case, they would win. I think the union would win a grievance on that anyway, to be honest. But boards will want to do that, and sometimes they want to do it if it gets out to the parents. So they do it as a show for parents, but forgetting about the support for the teacher. But it is the right answer is it would be hard to fire that teacher if they identified as a person with a substance use disorder. But people do think different things about that. Except it's a mental health issue. Now the teacher has to do something about it. That's super important. Okay, so we do have rights. In this case, the teacher would lose the ability to say, I don't want to go to treatment, but I want to keep my job. Like there are certain things by our actions, there are consequences. Even if we are unwell, the consequence would be you have to go for treatment. And they probably would be some form of discipline. I don't think they would be fired. Not the first time. So Maria is saying, so Maria, we are running into this more and more, the idea of, and this creates trauma. This adds to existing mental health issues, and it adds to people the severity of their substance use disorders. The idea, one, of the fear of this happening. So what Maria's written is people alleging teachers are doing things wrong and inventing things, and I think it goes more along the lines of including like videoing and misinterpreting like from videos what people are doing and doxing and all these things that we see now. Super stressful. It's emerging, and I think it's just great to point it out. Like, you know, we are diverging sometimes in our behaviors between people who are taking a human rights stance on things and people who are taking a non-human rights stance on things at times. And it creates a super unsafe work environment. Now, and add to that, if you are a trans person. So if you're a trans teacher and already there's this fear, and now you're a trans teacher, and not like other people can't be affected, but you know, you start adding layers to these things where the trauma is just building and building and building, and the fear is building and building and building. And you see how people's mental health collapses in these situations. All right, seems like we're good. If anybody has felt from this talk like you do need to debrief, if you have yourself felt like, wow, that was more triggering for me than I thought it was, you can send me a private message through Zoom here, I think, or maybe not. Oh, I'm not the moderator. You can reach me through our website at HumanWorks. I'm free to talk on the phone even right now. As soon as we're done, if you want to do that, I am available. I will answer my number of the phone, even if it's and you can get my number off of our website. Actually, I'll just put it in the chat.
Thank
I
you,
trust
Wade.
you all. Yeah.
Thank you.
So if anybody is feeling they need to debrief, you can give me a call. How do I get accommodation to get out of a chaotic, abusive, and sometimes violent assignment? Okay, so it's a great question. There's accommodation is based on medical requirements. So you could just potentially ask for a new job, or next year try to, I don't know what your terminology is, but here we say post into a new job. So you could just, you know, apply for a new position next year, and maybe that would work out. However, if you are currently in a role that is not sustainable and you need out now, you would go to your union and say, what are my options for getting out of this situation into an accommodated situation? But you will need to provide probably something medical that says medically you are unable to manage this. It doesn't have to provide to the employer the diagnostic reasons, but it does need to be validated around this is for medical reasons. So your wellness, your medical wellness is being affected by this situation. It is unlikely there would be a new job for you this year, but an argument would be made for you. So you might have to come up with something temporary or some other type, or just be on leave for this year, because there aren't oftentimes like a job sitting there waiting for somebody, right? And so if there is work there, your union can help you to negotiate that. If there isn't, you maybe have to be on medical leave, but then working with your union, who will work with the board around. So I mean, your bargaining units, working with your bargaining unit around with the board around accommodation based on medical, and they will know that process. So you do not have to stay in a chaotic, abusive, and violent assignment, but it does have to be medicalized to get out of it from an accommodation standpoint. But there are other avenues. I recommend you talk to your bargaining union. Well, thanks everybody. It's super complex, these topics, but I think it's good just to even talk about it a little bit. Think about some of these things, and think about how we feel about them, but also think about how it affects us and our colleagues. I really appreciate that you took the time to be here today. Yeah.
Wonderful. So thank you for joining us for this session. And Wade, thank you again for coming in. You've spent three different sessions with us. This session in particular, you provided some wonderful feedback and information and support and advice for our educators across the province. And I think what shone through your presentation was your compassion and your ability to sort of talk about some really difficult topics in a kind and gentle way. So thank you so much for that.
Well, thank you.
In the coming days, you will receive a follow-up email from OTF, and that'll be a link to the evaluation form. I also placed that in the chat for you, other resources from OTF, and a link to the archive version of this webinar. Our next webinar is April the 4th on 2024 at 4:30. It's Culturally Relevant and Responsive Pedagogy with Karen Devonish-Mizzotto. On behalf of OTF, thank you so much for being here today. And Wade, thank you again for your expertise. Have a wonderful evening, everyone.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Until we meet again. Yeah, thanks so much.